Story 1. Let me take you back to a time when my friends and I were just kids, living in an HDB and enjoying the simple pleasures of childhood. Our playground was our kingdom, and soccer was our game of choice. There were plenty of us, but we always tried to keep the noise down. We were considerate, we thought, but that didn't stop an entitled Karen from crashing into our world. It was a regular evening when my helper took my little brother and me downstairs to play with the other kids. Soccer had been our main gig, but this time we decided to switch things up a bit. Nerf guns were the new stars of the show. We were having a blast, laughing and joking, firing foam darts at each other with abandon. Little did we know, our peaceful evening was about to be disrupted. That's when she arrived, the so-called beast of the story. Karen, we later dubbed her. She stormed over to us with a look of pure annoyance on her face. "Karen, what are you people doing? Don't you have any respect for the rest of the neighbors? We all want to sleep, and you're keeping me awake." I couldn't help but glance at my watch. It was 6 in the evening, and she was dressed to the nines, looking completely awake and ready for a night on the town. We exchanged knowing glances and stifled giggles. "Karen, hey, don't mock me. I am older than you. I will call the police and get you all arrested for making too much noise." Our stifled giggles turned into full-blown laughter. We knew she couldn't do that. It was still before 8 p.m., and making noise at this hour wasn't against any rules. Karen had a knack for making it seem like we were in big trouble. My helper, along with some of her friends, stepped in to defend us. "Helper, we haven't done anything wrong. In fact, we've recorded the whole thing because we like recording kids having fun with their friends. Maybe you should relax a bit." Karen continued to rant and rave, but one of my friends had had enough. "Friend, why don't you just go away and leave us alone?" Surprisingly, Karen huffed and stormed off, pointing a finger at us as she left. We thought that was the end of it, shrugged off the encounter, and went on with our play. Little did we know that this encounter with Karen was just the beginning of our troubles. A few weeks later, we were back at the playground, enjoying a spirited game of soccer. Most of us were there, and the cheers and shouts of excitement echoed through the air. The neighbors didn't seem to mind. After all, it was still daytime and well within acceptable noise levels. But then, our most formidable opponent arrived, Karen. She descended upon us like a storm, shouting at the top of her lungs. "Karen, give me the ball now, Oregon, you will get hurt." We were taken aback by her aggressive tone. We were just kids playing soccer, having a good time. Panic set in as we tossed the ball between us, running in different directions to evade her. My friend with the ball made a split-second decision to run down the nearby ramp, which was faster than the stairs Karen was attempting to navigate. As for me, I opted for the rocky path. I scrambled up the side of the staircase, using the rocks for leverage, and made my escape. We reconvened at my place, which was conveniently nearby. Panting and relieved, we realized that we had narrowly escaped what seemed like a scene from a horror movie. One of my friends, who had the foresight to look back, reported seeing Karen brandishing a kitchen knife. She had apparently intended to puncture our soccer ball. We breathed a collective sigh of relief, grateful for our narrow escape from what felt like a potential disaster. After that day, we didn't see Karen around anymore. It seemed she had given up on trying to catch us. We were just too fast and agile for her. We were a bunch of energetic, nimble children, and she was the epitome of an entitled Karen, overweight, out of shape, and unable to navigate a simple staircase without nearly falling over. Story 2. In our mid-20s, my husband and I purchased and moved into our rather modest first house with our infant daughter. It may be a big effort to meet and befriend our neighbors, and all of them warned me to be careful of one particular person, Jane. Jane had lived in the street for 3 years at this point and had earned herself the nickname Big Fat Jane, as she was manipulating, intimidating, and thoroughly awful. Jane ran a daycare from her house, but neighbors on both sides reported hearing her scream at the children and leave them unsupervised in the garden. It's important to note that Jane's partner is a police officer, The neighbors were scared of retaliation if they reported her or stood up to her. It seemed Jane would use this to get away with her horrific behavior. Our house had a driveway with a dropped curb big enough for one car, but we could fit both if you blocked in the first and only used the second car. Parking on the street was very limited, and we had double yellow lines outside our house, not allowed to stop park there. During some essential roof work, our driveway was taken up by scaffolding and a skip, so we parked in the street, and my husband parked outside Big Fat Jane's house. The next day when he went to his car, Big Fat Jane came running down her path shouting at him. She screamed about his antisocial parking, that his car would be towed, and that he could expect it to be scratched up if he left it there any longer. My husband calmly explained it was a public road, and she had no right to police the space. Her screeches at this point were loud enough that I and several neighbors heard and came to see the commotion. Her partner was perched at the door during all of this, saying and doing nothing. When she saw me on the pavement with our daughter, she pointed and screamed, "You'll have the social on you if you don't get lost. I'll scratch you right up." At this point I told my husband to come back, and we were calling the police. She responded, "Call the police, I dare you. He's pointing at her partner, a policeman. He'll sort you out. You won't know what hit you." At this point my husband looked at her husband and said, "Is that right? And you're agreeing with what she said?" The partner nodded and said, "You need to move or accept the consequences. You call the police, it won't get you anywhere." Funnily, when I then took out my phone and dialed the non-police emergency number on speakerphone and made a police report, both of them looked a lot less confident. Big Fat Jane stood there open-mouthed, then grabbed her partner and slammed the door, and we haven't heard from her since. Her partner was placed on suspension due to the allegation, and further allegations from our neighbors. He then returned to an admin role. After our confrontation, Big Fat Jane was given a warning for a public order offense. However, due to a number of reports, her daycare closed, and she is no longer able to mind children. Their house is up for sale. However, as she made a number of modifications without proper planning or work people, its price is significantly lower than they expected, and they're in negative equity. All because of a parking space. Story 3. Okay, so a bit of backstory. So I just recently turned 18 and got a backpack from my aunt a few months before. It's a really nice backpack, colored red, blue, and purple with a shark mouth in front. The thing with those types of bags is that they are only made a limited amount, and then they're not made anymore. Cast is me, entitled Karen and helpful bus driver. Actual story. So I'm currently studying to become a zookeeper, and the nearest school that specializes in that. It is about an hour away from where I live, so therefore, I take the bus every day. Yes, it's a bit of distance, but hey, what can you do? So I was riding the bus about a week ago. It was going normally until like 30 minutes into the ride, when an obvious Karen steps in. Due to COVID, you are not supposed to sit next to each other. And what did the Karen do? Yep, you guessed it. Since I'm very non-confrontational, I didn't say anything and just took my headphones in and listened to some music. Not even 5 minutes later, I feel a tab on my shoulder. "Can I help you?" Entitled Karen, "Oh, I just wanted to know where you got that backpack from." "Oh, I got it from the internet as a birthday gift." And do you know that feeling? When you know things are about to go sideways? Well, guess I was right. My son had a bag like that. I thought it's a limited edition, and I know it's sold out. But then again, he could have gotten it around the time I did. That's sad. When did he lose it? About a year ago. You couldn't get this bag a year ago. It wasn't even made at that point. I should never have said that. Karen then started to scream at me, so everyone in the bus began to look at us. Not very comfortable for me, by the way. "I know you stole it from my son, and if you don't give it to me right now, I will call the police to have you arrested." Even though I knew it was mine, I still got scared. I'm a male and around 190 centimeters, a big boy. But still very sensitive. It doesn't take much to make me break down sadly. The bus came to a stop and overcame my savior, who heard it all. Enter the helpful bus driver. "Ma'am, the police have been called, and we will solve this peacefully." Karen looked with a smug grin as the police arrived 10 minutes later. Cop 1. So what seems to be the problem? Karen, still screaming, this little brat stole my son's backpack, and I demand it back. Cop 1 says to me, is that true? Me. No, officer, I swear it's mine. Cop 2. Do you have any way to prove it? I was about to say no when I remembered. I can call my aunt. I called her. Hey, Auntie, can you just quickly tell me what you gave me for my birthday? My aunt, confused. Yeah, sure, I gave you that backpack. And what color is it? It's red, blue, and purple. Oh, and has a shark mouth at the front. Thanks, I'll explain everything when I see you. She then sends a picture of me opening the box with the backpack inside the date, November 15, 2020. Karen goes pale. She then tried to take my bag and make a run for it, but the helpful bus driver closed the doors before she could get out. Karen was then arrested for attempted theft, and I got an apology from almost everyone in the bus. To think people like this exist. Story 4. I had flown down to Philly for a week-long business trip, and little did I know that it would turn into a tale of vengeance that would satisfy even the most avid subscribers of Pro Revenge. My trip was relatively uneventful until that fateful Friday when I encountered a cab ride I would never forget. The week had been a whirlwind of meetings and presentations, and finally it was time to head back home. I called the client, and they promptly arranged a cab to take me to the airport. I had used this same cab company throughout my stay, and they had been reliable up until this point. As I settled into the back seat of the cab, I couldn't help but notice that something was off. The driver seemed distracted, constantly fiddling with his phone and not paying proper attention to the road. I nervously cleared my throat and politely asked him to focus on driving. A few miles into the journey, disaster struck. The distracted driver collided with another car. Thankfully, it wasn't a high-speed collision, but it was enough to jolt us and send our belongings flying. Fortunately, no one was injured, and both drivers pulled over to assess the damage. I knew I had to do the responsible thing and provide a statement to the police about the accident. While waiting for the cops to arrive, I looked at the taxi meter and noticed that it was still running, despite our unplanned stop. I pointed this out to the driver, who seemed unfazed by the whole situation. After what felt like an eternity, the police arrived, and I explained the circumstances of the accident. The cop was worried about my well-being due to the black eye I had sustained earlier in the week, but I assured him I was fine. I just wanted to get to the airport and make my flight. As I waited for the police report, I realized that the cab driver was making no effort to stop the meter from running. I called him out on it, and he reluctantly turned it off. By the time the ordeal was over, I had been at the accident scene for close to an hour. When I finally got into a new cab that the company had sent, I knew I was running out of time to catch my flight. I asked the new driver to hurry as much as possible, and he did his best to make up for the lost time. But the damage had already been done, and I would have to rush to make it to the airport. I couldn't believe the audacity of the cab company. You'd think that if one of their drivers had an accident with a passenger in the car, they would prioritize getting that passenger to their destination safely. Instead, not only did the second driver ask me to pay for the ride, but he also informed me that the owner of the cab company insisted that I pay for the first cab's meter as well. I couldn't help but feel a burning sense of injustice. I calmly explained to the second driver that while I understood the law allowed them to charge me for the ride, common decency and good business practice should dictate otherwise. I told him that if they hadn't charged me, I would have given him a generous tip. But now, as I was offended by their behavior, he would receive no tip from me. And then I hatched a plan that would not only seek justice for myself, but also teach this cab company a lesson they would never forget. You see, my client in Philly was a major bank, not Bank of America, but one of similar size. They frequently had consultants and contractors like me coming in to work with them, and they always relied on this cab company for local transportation. Knowing that I would be returning to Philly in just 2 weeks, I decided to take matters into my own hands. On Monday morning, I made a call to my contact at the bank. I explained the entire ordeal, from the accident to the unjust fare charges, and I asked them ever so politely to find another cab company for me to use during my upcoming visit. My contact at the bank was horrified by my story. They assured me that they, their employees, and any consultants or contractors working with them would never use that cab company again. They were adamant about finding a more reliable and customer-friendly transportation service for their business needs. Over the next 2 weeks, my contact followed through on their promise. They researched and contracted with a new, reputable cab company to provide transportation services for their clients and employees. It was a considerable blow to the cab company that had wronged me. When I returned to Philly for my next business trip, I was delighted to find that the new cab company provided excellent service. The drivers were professional, the cars were well maintained, and there was a noticeable absence of the shady practices that had marred my previous experience. As the months went by, the original cab company saw a significant drop in business from my client and others in the area. Word had spread about their unscrupulous practices and lack of concern for passenger safety. They struggled to compete with the new, reputable cab company that had gained favor with the bank and its clients. The cab company's reputation continued to plummet, and it wasn't long before they began losing contracts with other local businesses as well. Their revenue took a nosedive, and they were forced to make cutbacks to stay afloat. It was a satisfying sight to see them face the consequences of their horrible actions. In the end, I had my revenge, not through anger or retaliation, but by using the power of word of mouth and the influence of a major client. Story 5. About 3 years ago, my wife and I bought our house. We quickly realized that most of the property maintenance had been poorly handled. Renters had occupied the house before us, leaving many issues unattended. One of the significant projects that required attention was a full driveway replacement, as the original driveway hadn't been refinished or maintained in almost 30 years. Knowing we would need to replace the driveway, my wife and I began planning for the project. We decided to expand the driveway as well, given that our house was one of only 3 in the neighborhood without a 3-car garage. Our goal was to add a 3rd stall, even if it would be outside the garage, to accommodate more parking space. To proceed with the expansion, we had to request 3 separate bids. The first bid was for the driveway contractors themselves. The second was for the underground sprinkler system maintenance, as the expansion would affect the existing lines. The final bid went to a landscaper since our land wasn't entirely flat, and a retaining wall was necessary to create a level surface for the expanded driveway. Due to the involvement of multiple companies, we needed to ensure they could all work within the same time frame. The sprinkler maintenance was straightforward and not an issue. The driveway contractors were professional and provided us with over a month of flexibility to coordinate everything. However, problems arose with the landscaping company. Despite us clearly communicating our timeline and the scope of work, they repeatedly assured us that they could meet our deadlines. We scheduled the landscapers to start during the first week after the old driveway was removed. Unfortunately, they failed to show up. After calling and rescheduling for the following week, they again didn't appear. This repeated twice more, leaving us in a bind the day before the driveway contractors were due to return and complete their work. On the final scheduled day, the landscapers finally arrived. I spoke with them before heading to work, provided my contact information, and left them some refreshments, requesting they call me if any issues arose. When I returned home, I found no progress on the project. It turned out that as soon as I left, the landscapers packed up and went to another job. Frustrated, I called the owner to express my dissatisfaction. I had never been so upset about a service. The project manager later called me back, promising that the driveway would be completed first and any resulting issues would be corrected by their team afterward. Eventually, the driveway was poured, but the outcome was disappointing. About a week later, the landscapers finally constructed the retaining wall and attempted to add some finishing touches to the driveway. Unfortunately, the result was subpar, especially considering it was a brand new installation. They sent me a bill for the job, but I responded with photos and explained that I would not pay until the work was corrected to an acceptable standard. At first, my communications were ignored. 3 months passed before they realized I was serious about withholding payment for their poor work. When they finally reached out, they reviewed my email and saw the extent of the problems. By then, it was winter, and everything was frozen, delaying any corrective action. The landscaper expressed regret about not addressing the issues sooner, and I conveyed my frustration over being ignored for months. We discussed possible solutions and settled on one that would improve the appearance, albeit by reducing the driveway width by about a foot. Though not ideal, it was a compromise I could live with. One day, while I was at work, the landscapers returned and completed the modifications without prior notice. While it wasn't the solution I had envisioned, it was tolerable. After discussing with my wife, we decided to pay the bill, cut ties with the landscaper, and move on. The entire ordeal had taken over 6 months, and we were simply exhausted by the experience. About 5 months later, as spring approached, the landscaper began sending repeated requests for reviews. It was evident they were trying to boost their online presence to secure new projects for the upcoming season. After ignoring multiple emails, I eventually decided to write an honest review. In it, I detailed our experience, emphasizing the lack of communication, missed deadlines, and unprofessional conduct, along with photographic evidence. Within a week, my review garnered significant attention, earning me a Google reward for over 1,000 views. Another week later, the owner called, asking what could be done to rectify the situation. I told him that, nearly a year after the original project, there wasn't much that could be done without a time machine. Ultimately, while we did manage to expand the driveway, the result wasn't entirely satisfactory. The third parking slot is rarely used due to its tight fit, and the sight of the retaining wall still irks me. Despite the frustrations, I did receive a significant response to my review, which I hope spared others from similar headaches. In the end, I was initially willing to let go of the experience and move on. However, their persistent email campaign prompted me to share my story. A lesson for businesses: if you don't deliver quality service, perhaps refrain from asking dissatisfied customers for reviews. Story 6. I work in the heritage sector, providing specialized services to the construction industry ahead of developments as mandated by law. This story takes place a few years ago when my company was contracted to conduct work ahead of a large infrastructure project. To give you an idea of the scale, this project provided the majority of the workload for my company for nearly 4.5 years. The typical process for our work involves arriving several months or even years before actual construction begins. We excavate trenches, dig out features as they appear, document them through photographs, drawings, and measurements, and fill out extensive paperwork, sometimes about something as insignificant as a single indistinct furrow in a field full of identical furrows. We also send any artifacts back to the office for further processing. In this context, artifacts usually refer to fragments of pottery, bits of flint, and occasionally a piece of metal, often part of an old horseshoe. Once returned to the office, these artifacts, or finds as we call them, are cleaned, cataloged, and reviewed by specialists who compile further documentation about them. Eventually, all of this paperwork is combined into a final report for the client. At the time, the finds department handled the initial cataloging and cleaning. The head of this department was on maternity leave, and a temporary replacement was hired. Let's call her Alice. Alice was a recent graduate with a master's degree in finds conservation, or a similar field. She was eager to make a strong impression, hoping her contract would be extended once her predecessor returned. Seizing an opportunity, Alice decided to visit each site to introduce herself, explain new policies, review existing ones, and gather feedback. Ideally, this should have been a helpful exercise. Unfortunately, it didn't go as planned. I missed the meeting because I was off work, but my colleagues later gave me a detailed account of what transpired. The meeting was poorly timed. It was held on a Wednesday, with heavy rain forecasted for the rest of the week, and we still had a significant amount of work left to meet our quota. Our work involves operating heavy machinery and manual digging, and rain not only makes the job unpleasant, but also increases the risk of slipping in mud or dealing with waterlogged soil, which becomes significantly heavier. In extreme cases, it can even hide trip hazards or holes large enough for someone to fall into a hazard many of us, myself included, had experienced firsthand. Given the weather and the fact that the meeting was scheduled during lunch, my colleagues weren't in the best mood. Dave, the site supervisor, was preoccupied with figuring out how to complete 3 days' worth of work in half a day and wasn't paying much attention to Alice's presentation. Alice began by criticizing the poor labeling of materials being sent back, the fact that they arrived covered in mud, and the use of labels such as upper gray fill, which she deemed unhelpful. While these labels might not have been useful for office staff, they were essential for field staff trying to keep track of what went where. Alice then introduced a new policy requiring the use of fines trays, thin, lightweight plastic trays like those found at garden centers to store fines next to features instead of bagging them immediately. My colleagues pointed out that this was impractical. In real-world conditions, a gust of wind could scatter the contents of these flimsy trays across the field. Additionally, they would likely break within a week due to their fragility. Despite these concerns, Alice dismissed the feedback. One of my colleagues then asked how they were supposed to carry a toolbox, shovel, pickaxe, camera, photograph scales, and these fines trays to a feature that could be a 20-minute walk from the welfare unit. Alice's response was, "If you need it, you will find a way to carry it." This prompted my colleague to retort, "Well, we don't need them, so we won't bother." At this point, Dave realized things were escalating and started paying closer attention. The meeting moved on to the topic of fine selection. Each project has a detailed document outlining the criteria for what should be retained and processed. Typically, it permits site staff to discard modern material without recording it, and to record and discard other types of fines at the site director's discretion. During the meeting, someone sought clarification on the criteria for discarding objects. Alice became visibly angry, accusing the team of theft and threatening to report them to the police if she suspected they weren't properly recovering fines. She also declared that they had no expertise and no authority to determine what was archaeologically significant. This accusation was absurd, given that 95% of our job involves making precisely those determinations. Dave intervened and ended the meeting, allowing Alice to proceed to another site. When I returned the following Monday, my colleagues briefed me on the situation. Since Alice insisted we weren't experts and couldn't decide what was significant, we decided to follow her instructions to the letter. Normally, we discard modern rubbish from the topsoil. This time, we bagged everything: empty soda cans, fast food wrappers, broken glass, all of it. By the end of the first day, we had filled several large bags with fines. By the end of the week, we needed a garbage bag to transport everything to the office. This continued for several weeks, with Alice unable to admit her mistake. A month later, the process changed. Instead of sending fines to our office for initial processing, they were sent directly to head office. Shortly afterward, Dave received a call from Alice's manager. Alice's manager: "Are your staff a bunch of idiots?" Dave: "No." Alice's manager: "Then why are they sending us bags of literal rubbish?" Dave: "Because they were told to." Alice's manager: "What?" Dave recounts meeting with Alice. Alice's manager: "Oh, for goodness sake. Just tell them to go back to doing it properly. I'll deal with Alice." We returned to our standard procedures, though somewhat reluctantly, as we had been enjoying ourselves. Alice had a meeting with her manager, who made it clear that the unqualified staff had over 30 years of combined experience, with the least experienced among us having far more field experience than Alice. Alice was prohibited from issuing instructions without managerial approval. When the original head of fines returned from maternity leave, staff were overjoyed. She had worried about disrupting the workflow upon her return, but in reality, everyone had been counting down the days. Alice, having alienated both field and office staff, was eventually demoted to an assistant role and left the company a couple of years later without causing further trouble. Story 7. I worked for about 5 years at a company where, by the end, I felt completely drained and severely stressed due to the constant mistreatment. By the time I left, I was performing a supervisor's duties without receiving the appropriate compensation, and I wasn't even assigned to the shift I was supervising. To give you an idea of how terrible this company was, I received nearly a $10 per hour pay increase at my new job, with only a fraction of the responsibilities I previously had. Everything was fine until the global health crisis hit, and considering the industry I had transitioned into, it was inevitable that I would eventually receive a termination notice. The following year turned out to be one of the most chaotic, stressful, and difficult periods of my life. Without diving into too many unnecessary details, I had to terminate my contract with one staffing agency after they falsely padded my resume. Unfortunately, the new agency I joined engaged in deceptive practices. They initially promised me administrative experience, which aligned with my ongoing studies, but ultimately sent me back to my former employer, the very place I had been desperate to leave. Why did this happen? My former employer had become their largest client since they were a respiratory medical device company, and demand for their products had surged dramatically. Desperate for an income, I reluctantly agreed and continued sending out resumes in the meantime. I only stayed for 4 weeks, but the workplace environment was horrendous, resembling a chaotic battlefield run by extremely difficult and demanding managers. The tactics employed by the company to extract maximum productivity were shocking. One particular scheme involved offering a cash bonus of $2,000 to employees who worked more than 20 hours of overtime per week between Thanksgiving and New Year's. Predictably, many employees, desperate for extra income, took enormous risks to make it to work, even during hazardous winter weather conditions. During my brief return, we experienced 2 significant winter storms that shut down much of the state. Yet the company exploited every possible loophole to avoid paying out the promised bonuses. The company also lacked basic empathy. One morning, while driving to work, my car broke down due to a mechanical failure, leaving me stranded. I immediately contacted both the staffing agency and my employer, informing them of my situation. However, I was told that if I didn't arrive on time, I would lose my job. Despite arriving 2 hours late, they complained to the staffing agency, insisting that I should stay beyond my shift to assist the overnight crew and make up for the lost time. I eventually left when I secured a full-time position with another medical device company. It was a huge relief to part ways with the staffing agency and my former employer. However, during my time there, I had made friends much like fellow captives bonding over shared hardship. Many of them remained employed at the company, and through them, I learned about an upcoming event, a workplace contest. The contest was organized by an independent business magazine in our state, which held an annual competition to determine the best company to work for. Remarkably, my former employer had won this award a year before I initially left. Enough time had passed for them to reapply, and the company's management, residing in their figurative ivory towers, was overly confident that they could reclaim the title. The competition involved a company interview conducted by the magazine, followed by an employee survey. A link to the survey was distributed among employees. Through one of my friends still employed there, my former colleagues and I in a messaging group learned about the survey. Our friend agreed to act as a mole, and when the survey link was sent out, former employees like me also received access to it. Needless to say, we were brutally honest in our feedback. At the end of the survey, there was a section for additional comments, and I detailed the mistreatment I had endured during my first stint with the company. I also described how, when I was forced to return, I left after my former manager insulted me in an email for daring to leave in the first place, while cynically using her own personal struggles as an excuse for her behavior. You might think the story ends there, but it doesn't. That was only the beginning of our plan for revenge. The turning point came when someone in the messaging group discovered something extraordinary. By opening the survey in an incognito browser, it could be submitted multiple times. Armed with this newfound knowledge, we felt as though we had been handed a powerful tool and decided not to waste the opportunity. We submitted as many negative surveys as possible. Meanwhile, our mole kept us updated on the Human Resources Department's communications. Once the company announced they had achieved a 90% participation rate, we ceased our activity and waited. A week before the results were scheduled to be announced, our mole informed us that celebratory drinks had been stocked in the breakroom fridges. The company's LinkedIn and Facebook pages were filled with posts about the contest, confidently boasting about their imminent victory. Then, the day of the announcement arrived. Our mole reported that management was in a state of disarray. The celebratory drinks quietly disappeared from the fridges, and all social media posts referencing the contest were swiftly deleted. Employees were explicitly forbidden from discussing the contest or the results. It turned out that the survey feedback was so overwhelmingly negative that the magazine reached out to the company to review the results in detail. The blow to the company's reputation was severe, and they never fully recovered. In the years that followed, they struggled to stay afloat and eventually had to delist from the stock exchange, relying instead on venture capital funding to survive. While the company's decline wasn't solely due to our actions, it was satisfying to know that we had played a part in exposing the truth about their toxic work environment. Our collective efforts ensured that they would no longer be able to boast about being the best company to work for.